Hi, everyone. I'm Rolan Monje, and I serve as an evangelist and teacher here in Asia. Welcome to this class series. I want to thank Cesar and Jennifer Lopez and the rest of the leadership group for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate the worldwide brotherhood that we have in the ICOC. We in the Philippines are so thankful for the LA Church for your partnership in the gospel. Little over 30 years ago, the Manila Church was planted with prayers and sacrifices of disciples from all over the US and especially the West Coast. Until today, we keep connected. You're very connected to us. We keep connected on so many different levels. We appreciate your prayers and your support for us, especially with natural calamities that we've had to face in recent years. Now, 2020 has been difficult. It's been a perplexing and difficult year. And as your brother, as an evangelist who's thinking about the health and growth of the movement, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for staying faithful through these trying times. It's just good to know that we're all in this together, fighting together, suffering together, learning together, navigating the challenges, knowing that God is faithful and the storm is passing over. Well, on to the lesson, getting the most from the Old Testament. Today, I just want to do two things. First, I want to offer some motivation to study the Old Testament. And second, I want to give you some tips to make your study of the Old Testament more interesting and fun. Next week, I'll be giving more tips. And along the way, I'll unpack some specific concepts that hopefully will spark your interest. Why study the Old Testament? I remember asking a congregation of fairly mature Christians, who among us have read the entire Bible? Only about half raised their hands. Later in fellowship, many confessed that they got bored or bogged down with the Old Testament. In most religious circles, the Old Testament is viewed as difficult or antiquated. After all, it's the Old Testament. And admittedly, it can be confusing. What do you do with all these laws, these bizarre laws? What do you do with these weird practices and names you can't even pronounce? It can be discouraging. Well, the Old Testament isn't frequently heard in sermons. It's rarely preached and rarely studied in quiet times. And even those who make the noble resolution to read the Bible in a year, right? To read the Bible straight through. You know how it is. You start fired up in Genesis, you're still okay in Exodus, you get confused in Leviticus, you get discouraged in Numbers, and many you just give up in Deuteronomy, right? Many Christians, even though they feel familiar with parts of the Old Testament, they grow up hearing the stories, but they they just don't know it that well. Many of these stories are just stored in their memory banks without much significance. But the Old Testament has so much to offer to us as Christians. Think about it. Out of the 1189 chapters in our Bible, 969 of those are from the Old Testament. We would be amiss in attitude if we neglect the three quarters of our Bibles, right? You've got 929 chapters, 929 chapters in the Old Testament compared to 260 in the New Testament. I'm not pitting the Old Testament against the New here. I'm just trying to make a point. And remember the words of Jesus in Luke 24? Jesus makes a fundamental statement here, and it's very pointed. He says in Luke 24, in verse 44, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Interesting. The Old Testament points us to Jesus, his person, his nature, his purpose, his character. And during his ministry, Jesus constantly appealed to the Old Testament as a source of authority. Here, before his ascension, he states that he was going to fulfill the Old Testament and that the Old Testament is all about him. All these should remind us of the importance of the Old Testament. For me personally, the Old Testament has really helped me during some of my toughest times. I've been a disciple for over 30 years, and that's all by the grace of God. But I think about this last decade. Wow, this last decade hasn't been easy. The last 10 years for me has brought some of the most difficult challenges, all sorts of overwhelming trials. And I remember just turning to the Old Testament so many times. It's helped me to see in very comforting, very moving ways the character of God. So let's go on with our tips. General tips. How do we view or approach the Old Testament? I believe these tips can level up our study of the Old Testament. Number one, keep the big story in mind. We got to keep the big story. The Old Testament has many characters and events. There's a lot going on. There's so many particulars and pieces of information. But there is a story that's being unfolded in its pages. So when you mind the story, you won't get lost in the details. It's important to know the story. And as you read, be aware of where you're at in the story. For example, let's say you're reading Exodus or Leviticus. Yeah, let's do Leviticus. I know that's a favorite for some of you, Leviticus. But Leviticus is a story in the middle of a longer story, a saga, in fact, right? So you've got Leviticus, and before that, you've got Exodus, and even before that, you've got Genesis. So you've got to be mindful of what's going on in Exodus as it relates to Leviticus. And then after Leviticus, you've got Numbers and Deuteronomy. So be sensitive when you're reading a book of the Old Testament that there's something before it and after it. That's just an example of Leviticus being part of the Pentateuch or the books of Moses. So keep the big picture in mind when you're reading the Old Testament. To help us with that, let's look at the stages of biblical history. So here's a quick rundown of biblical history. We start in Genesis, and that's the creation phase or the creation stage. God creates the backdrop of everything that's going to happen in human history. So he puts the heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, and stars, and then the earth, just for the pinnacle of his creation, which is man. So Genesis 1 through 11. When you get to Genesis 12, you've got a zooming in. The camera zooms in on a family, the family of Terah, and the family of Abraham, eventually leading to the patriarchs. So you've got the patriarchal stage with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These are patriarchs, heads of families. Then you come to Exodus. When the curtain rises in Exodus, you see the Israelites are in bondage. They're in slavery in Egypt, and so God has to deliver them. That's what happens in Exodus through Deuteronomy. And they're traveling through the wilderness, and God, after delivering them, brings them to the promised land in Canaan. They conquer the promised land, and that's the conquest stage where you have Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And that leads us to what's known as the United Kingdom. United Kingdom stage, not connected to Britain, but United Kingdom, which is the golden era of Israel, featuring three famous kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, when Solomon dies, the nation is thrown to chaos because you have a split. You've got the civil war and the split of the north and the south. You've got 10 tribes to the north and 2 tribes to the south. And because both kingdoms, with a succession of kings, are steeped in idolatry and sin, God has to humble them. And so the 10 tribes to the north are eventually deported. The invasion of the Assyrians makes that happen. And then for the south, later on, it's the Babylonian invasion that happens. So that leads us to the exile. There was a time when it was only the southern kingdom because the Assyrian invasions happened first, right? So the exile, also known as the captivity, is roughly 70 years because God had to humble them and make them realize what they had done, how they had fallen into rebelliousness and apostasy. But then God is faithful and compassionate, so he allows them to return, and that brings us to the return with Ezra and Nehemiah. So those are the eight stages of biblical history pertaining to the Old Testament. You've got 2 more for the New Testament: the gospel stage, the time of Jesus, and the early church stage. So all these, you have a timeline, right? A timeline for the whole Bible. Great. So I think of these stages, and well, one, it really helps me understand the Bible as a whole, so I won't get lost in the details, like I mentioned. But this reminds me also that God's story is bigger than you think. God's story is bigger than you think. That's a good thought, even in this pandemic. It's tough, we're waking up to a different world, and so much is limited. I wish that I could be with you and teach in person, like before. But I'm just recording this from my daughter's study nook. So we're all just trying to do our best. Some of us are pretty adjusted, some of us are not, but it's tough. And if you're like me, most of March to October is just one huge anxiety attack. That's just how I am. Sometimes I lose sleep and my emotions are in flux. But prayers and the Bible and the fellowship, these have helped me. And this thought has helped me too. When I look at the screen, I'm reminded to take the long view because there's a bigger story unfolding and better days are ahead. So, those are the stages of biblical history. And when you're reading a book of the Bible, it's good to know where the book falls in this timeline. Now, to understand the story, take note of literary markers. These literary markers move the story forward and they serve as signposts. They remind us that there's a continuing narrative. So check out Genesis 1 and 2. You have here in Genesis 1, God saw all that he had made. Genesis 2, thus the heavens and earth were finished. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So that's the beginning of Genesis. Look here at the end of Exodus. In Exodus 39, Moses inspected the work and saw that they had done it just as the Lord had commanded. Exodus 40, and so Moses finished the work. Exodus 39, so Moses blessed them. Do you see the connections there? See the connections? So saw, finished, blessed. So these are markers that connect Exodus with Genesis. Beginning of Genesis with the end of Exodus. And these markers bracket Genesis and Exodus, serving as bookends. And they also help us to see that there's a story that's being moved forward. The markers show up in English translations, and this is even more apparent when we look at the Hebrew behind the English translations, when we look at the Hebrew words and phrases. So the markers show up in English, but they're even more evident in Hebrew. Let's look at more literary markers. In Genesis 12, this is when God talks to Abraham. And here we're looking at the promises to Abraham, which are actually a good framework for understanding the entire Old Testament. In Genesis 12, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Verse 2, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now check out the end of the Old Testament. Let's look at Nehemiah and Malachi. Nehemiah 9:23 says, "You made their children as numerous as the stars in the sky." And Malachi 3 says, "Then all the nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land." Interesting. When you look at Nehemiah, which is the end of the Old Testament from a historical perspective, because we're looking at the Persian period, Nehemiah 9 talks about the children of Israel being numerous. And then Malachi, the end of the Old Testament from a literary perspective, being the last book written, talks about the nations calling them blessed, right? And them being in a land. So you see here the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. Now, another type of literary marker is seen in the fulfillment formulas. In 2 Kings 15, so the word of the Lord spoken to Jehu was fulfilled. 2 Chronicles 10, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam. And in 2 Chronicles 36, in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus king of Persia, and so on. Now, you'll see this time and again in the narratives, and they will help you to recall something that was said earlier by God through certain people. This is a great study in itself, but the theology here cannot be diminished. These are placed to show that when God says something, it's going to happen. And so we can be assured about the reliability of God's words. Interesting. Well, during this pandemic, I hope that you've seen the reliability of God's words. The world has changed radically, in fact, but God has not, and His words remain the same. His words stand firm and trustworthy. Now, a last tidbit here on point number one, or tip number one, following the story. You can grasp the whole story of the Old Testament by reading these books straight as a continuous narrative. The Old Testament has 39 books, but if you simply want to understand the flow of the Old Testament, the flow of the narrative, to know the basic components of the story, just check these out. Check these books out: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So not all 39 books appear here, but you'll get a good grasp of the storyline by reading these. These 14 books will help you understand the timeline or the storyline of the Old Testament. What about the other books? We'll get to that in a moment. Just know that these 14 books will give you the basic plot, including some major subplots in the Old Testament story. So much for the first tip. Keep the big story in mind. That was the first tip. Now let's go on to the second tip. Think history with commentary. The Old Testament is history plus commentary. Does anybody here like history? Well, history books, or those that deal with real life, like biographies, anecdotes, these are nonfiction books, and they tend to fall into two types. You've got straightforward narration and analysis. Straightforward narration, meaning narrative history, and then you have evaluation. Others tend to be more analytical. So you can think along those lines when you look at the Old Testament. Two categories of books. You can look at the 39 books of the Old Testament as of two types. First would be history. Here you have history as simply a record of events. So these books, they provide narrative and facts. So these are stories and records. Examples are Exodus, Samuel, and Ezra. So these are the types of books that move the storyline forward. Now, a second category would be commentary. These give comment to history either during or after the events. Examples include Psalms and Lamentations. So as the events happened, people would comment on those events. In other words, some books are of this type, recording, chronicling events, but others are retelling or expressing opinions on those events. To help us understand this better, let's look at this chart. Here in the middle, you have the main storyline, and that's moved or driven along by these books: Genesis to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. We've talked about these 14 books already. So the main storyline you can follow through these 14 books. And what about the other books? Well, Job gives insight into Genesis. You have that same period, the patriarchal period, Genesis 12 to 50, and Job seems to fall in that era, that stage. And so Job would then help us understand things about that era. To understand Judges better, read Ruth. So Ruth sheds light on this period of Israel's history, and so on. So you've got First Chronicles and Psalms illuminating the period of the Second Kings, or the events that happen in Second Samuel, rather, in Second Samuel. And then to understand First Kings better, read Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Second Chronicles, as these books are connected to the events that happen in First Kings. For Second Kings, you have the prophets here, although for some of these prophets that ministered to the south, they would overlap with respect to the themes and events that happen in Daniel and beyond. But anyway, we find here the list of prophets that relate to the events that happen in Second Kings. Moving on, you've got Ezra and Nehemiah. In order to understand Ezra better, you read Esther, Haggai, and Zechariah. So once you understand the story that's happening in Ezra, then you read these books that shed light on Ezra. Likewise, for Nehemiah, Malachi is associated with that time period, and so Malachi sheds light on the events that happen in Nehemiah. So again, I hope this is helpful. Look at the Old Testament books as of two types: history and commentary. Follow the timeline, the storyline through these books, and as you read these other books, know that they relate to and they shed light on the historical books. All right, number 3, remember the centrality of Torah. Remember the centrality of Torah. Recall what Jesus says in Luke 24. He says, everything about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So it's all about him, but then he also talks about 3 sections. Did you catch that? 3 sections of the Old Testament. So if you look at the books of the Old Testament, Jesus sees them as falling in 2 categories, 3 sections. Now that's different than what we have in most English Bibles. In most English Bibles, they're arranged according to genre. So you have law first, the 5 books of Moses, also known as the Pentateuch. And then you have history, the historical books. You've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, all the way to Esther. And then you have poetry. Poetry, that's the 3rd section where you have 5 books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then Song of Songs. And then prophecy, okay? The prophets. So 4 parts in that arrangement in most English Bibles: law, history, poetry, and prophecy. Now the Jews saw the Old Testament differently, and Jesus mentions the three sections with which the Jews reckoned the Bible. So the Jews arranged their material differently, and you can look at them as concentric circles. First, Jesus referred to the law of Moses, that's Torah, and then the prophets and the writings. So first you have the Torah, the books of Moses, Torah meaning instruction, or as Jews would say, HaTorah, the law or the instructions. And then you have the prophets, that's called in Hebrew Nevi'im. Navi is a prophet. Nevi'im is plural for Navi, prophets. And then you have Ketuvim, writings. Katab means to write, and so Ketuvim, a plural form from Katav. When Jesus refers to the Psalms here, Psalms is representative of this section of writings, the Psalms being the longest of the books in this section called the writings. Now, note the widening circles. You've got Torah in the middle, and then the prophets, and then the writings. But note the position of Torah. Torah is central. The Jews saw the Torah as the most significant among the 3 sections. Everything streams from Torah. Now, this will help you connect the different parts of the Old Testament. For example, when reading Isaiah or the other prophets, it's good to know that the prophets were enforcers of Torah. They saw Torah as central, and they will cite Torah and refer to Torah. They go back to the tenets of Torah time and again. Similarly, when you're looking at the writings, keep your eyes peeled for how the writings use the material in the Torah. For example, the Psalms talk about the Exodus. Psalm 78, for example, talks about the Exodus experience. So I like this picture because it reminds us of the connections between all the books of the Old Testament especially when you think about it as emanating or stemming from the tenets or the principles taught in Torah. And I also like this picture because it reminds us of a standard. Torah is an unchanging standard, just like God's word is a yardstick for evaluating our lives. We have to go back to the Bible as the standard for our lives. You know, that's very relevant for this pandemic. Various troubles or problems in the world today just throw us off. You think about all the social forces and cultural norms that can suck us in, even before the pandemic, right? But a good question for us as disciples is, do we stray from the standard or do we uphold the standard of God? Also, just as the prophets were students of Torah who passionately preached it, we as disciples are prophetic voices. In the confusion of the times, in the depression of the times, we are voices of reason, sensitivity, calmness, and peace. All right, so to end here, we've got three general tips that I hope will be helpful for your study of the Old Testament. Number one, keep the big story in mind. There's a story, and it's a wonderful story. Think about the grand narrative. This story is God's chosen vehicle through which we can understand his great plan for Israel and also for us. Number two, think history with commentary. That's what the Old Testament has. It's history plus commenting on the events that happened in history. Some books are geared toward narrative history, others shed light or comment on those stories. And then number three, you've got the centrality of Torah. Remember the centrality of Torah. The tenets taught in Torah are reinforced elsewhere. So as you read your Old Testament, do try to apply these tips and let me know how they help you. Before we end, some reflection points which can also be discussion starters. 3 questions here. Which parts of the Old Testament do you love most? Second, which part of the Old Testament do you wish to study in a deeper way? And third, how does it make you feel knowing that God is sovereign over the big story of our lives? Thanks for watching. Until next time, God bless.